Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Ian Lekus. Ian is the Policy and Communications Specialist for the Council for Global Equality. He's an internationally recognized expert on global LGBTQI human rights and has been an LGBTI thematic specialist at Amnesty International USA since 2013. Also joining us, my colleague Alex Long. Alex is a Wilson Center Program Associate with the Science and Technology Innovation Program. He also serves as chair of the LGBTQI plus Employee Resource Group as part of the Wilson Center's Diversity and Inclusion Council. They join us today to discuss the global struggle for LGBTQI plus rights. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you for having me. And happy
Thanks for having me back, John.
So, Ian, let's begin with you if we could. And generally speaking, when we look at the biggest picture, the broadest picture, is this a moment of progress or regress?
I suspect you won't be surprised to know that it's both and that those are linked. That we're at a time where we're seeing remarkable progress in the United States and around the world, and we're seeing tremendous backlash. And that much of the backlash is fueled by the success of the LGBTQI movements. Which is a movement that is vibrant not only in the global north and in the wealthiest countries, but there are groups in pretty much every sub-Saharan African country, for example. And I think one of the things I was thinking about in terms of taking stock of where we are right now is, we're 11 years past when then Secretary Clinton talked about LGBTQI rights are human rights. Human rights are LGBTQI rights. And that's something that activists around the world know, in their bones, in their lived experience. But at the same time, the backlash, the regress is about the attack on LGBTQI people is an attack on human rights, broadly speaking.
Is it a case where it's just too much too soon for some people? Well, how do you calibrate that? Of course, any movement wants to make progress, but as you're saying, what you're describing is sometimes you're sort of damned by your own success.
Now, certainly we've seen, pretty much all social movements have some version of, people who you've got a point, but go slower. I mean, certainly the American Civil Rights Movement, the entire long history of the Black freedom struggle is a history of people saying, go a little slower. So that is not uniquely an American story by the anyway, nor is it uniquely an LGBTQI story. But I do think that we're seeing a world where we have a concerted attack on core human rights and core democratic institutions that's happening in the global north and the global south, and that there is a particularly concerted anti-LGBTQ and anti-reproductive rights movement that is highly coordinated, that is looking to, that this is often a convenient place to start, when rolling back basic rights about freedom of assembly, freedom of political speech, and other core political and civil human rights.
Alex, I want to give you an opportunity to ask a question, but I realize I want to rewind the tape a second and ask Ian one other question that I should have asked up front, Ian, which is tell our viewers about the Council for Global Equality in case they're not familiar with it.
Right. The Council for Global Equality was founded in 2008, and we now have 32 members who work together to promote a LGBTQI inclusive and affirming U.S. foreign policy. And this includes most of the major domestic LGBT organizations, as well as a lot of significant human rights organizations in the US, and health and human rights organizations.
Thank you. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, so Ian, it's great to meet you. And I guess I want to start my question with, having been in this space and in the DC policymaking space for as long as I have, I've seen a lot of movement, especially in just the past 5 years, with promoting LGBTQI plus rights as a form of diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, through the work that you do with the Council for Global Equality, and then also your past work, how you see promoting these human rights for LGBTQI plus people as a form of effective diplomacy for the United States.
Right. I think there's a number of things that come to mind. Certainly, the White House, just clarified, for example, its position on marriage equality. Previously, there was a policy that basically prohibited embassies from promoting marriage equality movements. Now the guidance is with the principle of do no harm and from the principle of take the lead from actors on the ground, where there's an effective opportunity, such as we see in Thailand and Vietnam right now, to promote marriage equality, local embassies are welcome to do so. And that's part of it. I think that we're also seeing it when it comes there. We're very early in this, but I think we're beginning to understand, or that the mechanisms of humanitarian relief are beginning to understand that emergency humanitarian relief needs to be LGBTI inclusive. And that we see that in the mass migration out of Ukraine, in the emergency in Afghanistan last year, and that continues, that the fate of civil society and the fate, in a crisis, has to understand that not everybody has is in a heterosexual in a traditional nuclear family. Not everybody has a gender presentation that matches their identity documents. And so that when we're working with international institutions and with bilateral relationships, that this has to be part and parcel of the broader agenda.
Ian, identifying regress can be easy, unfortunately, because often it takes an ugly form, right?
Yeah.
But what are the best ways to measure progress?
The the Council for Global Equality in partnership, and this really gets to Alex's previous question here, recently published a scorecard of 30 major characteristics of progress when it comes to lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and intersex rights. And I should note, we could come back to this, but outside the United States, LGBTI, including intersex, is pretty much the default. It's just beginning to sort of be included in US discourse. But we put together, and again, with our partners at Franklin and Marshall's Global Barometers Project, a scorecard ranking the 110 participants on how they've taken measures to protect, around political and civil human rights, on socioeconomic rights, and on freedom from discrimination and violence. And so having, we all know the number of scorecards out there. We can think of Freedom House, The Economist, many more, and that all provide a whole bunch of useful ones. This is sort of the most comprehensive, at least for the 110 countries that attended the Summit for Democracy. And so that, and I should give props to Malta, the only country in the world that got a perfect score. So this ranges from some of the things you might imagine around non-discrimination legislation, around the rights of organizations to register. It also includes, sort of factors around how easy or difficult is it for trans and non-gender conforming individuals to sort of change their legal documentation. And are there laws, for example, for intersex people, and it's preventing surgically or medically unnecessary surgical interventions.
Alex?
Yeah, and I think that I was looking at those scorecards earlier, and as someone who has done some work in global health as well, the amount of indexes and rankings I'm very familiar with, and I'm interested to know, when you are working to try to promote more inclusive foreign policy, how hard or easy is it to come to the table with these countries who score so low? What do you have to take into consideration when you are having these really difficult conversations, but trying to get to some sort of compromise?
It's a great question. And as you might imagine, it's easy, it's some of the effectiveness is sort of the countries that think they're doing really well and are surprised that they're getting a B or a C rather than an A. And that for them, their public relations mechanism, what they want their reputation to look like, it's a lot easier to engage those countries. But we certainly have been engaged in conversations about, for example, there's going to be a follow-up summit sometime in the first half of 2023. And we realize that it's unlikely that oppression of LGBTI people is unlikely on its own to preclude a follow-up invitation. But we are, working with the government to talk about how do you in fact engage countries. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I believe it's something between 25 and 30 of the summit participants from last December that continue to criminalize consensual same-sex sex. And so we, sort of making it clear that this is not optional, and that the conversations at the summit around corruption, fighting corruption, for example, you can't. If this is not a take it or leave it, a la carte menu of democracy.
When you look at the range of high and low among the 110 nations, is it possible to begin to identify trends as far as best practices, things that work, circumstances that lead to progress? And similarly, can you generalize about those countries that lag behind? Is it religious factors, cultural factors, or is it distinct from country to country?
Somewhat distinct from country. I mean, there certainly are really sweeping generalizations, but those generalizations do sometimes break down at the granular level. For example, I recently wrote, wearing my amnesty cap, a letter on behalf of a Ghanaian asylum seeker. And Ghana is complicated because on one hand, it ranks really well when it comes to Ghanaians valuing their religious and ethnic diversity, that the national identity is important in a way that, when we see countries fracturing along religious or ethnic lines, Ghana is not there and is a pretty stable country and has a functional civil society. At the same time, it ranks pretty poorly even among sub-Saharan African countries when it comes to LGBTQI rights. And there's, we've seen in the last year, the proposal of a truly horrendous bill that takes some of the worst features of what we've seen in Uganda, Nigeria, and in Russia and Hungary, combining them all into one bill. So we're deeply concerned about that. And we've seen, again, sort of arrests of, there was an arrest spring of last year of about 25 activists in the city of Ho for basically meeting to talk about LGBTI rights.
You mentioned Orban and Putin and people who would certainly be villains in the story that we're talking about today. Who are the heroes? Where are you seeing voices that are strong and leading the charge? We have an America's 360 podcast, and on the newest episode, we talk about LGBTQI rights in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the things I learned in preparing for that interview is that Canada was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to recognize same-sex marriage. So when you look for the opposite of the villains, who are the heroes?
Right. I mean, first and foremost, I would put the human rights defenders around the world often working in dangerous conditions. But looking at this from a state policy point of view, I think you're absolutely right about Canada being a leader. Certainly, we've seen strong support over the last 5 and 10 years from the Nordic countries and from the Netherlands, but also in Latin America. Latin America's polarization in many ways matches that of the United States, and that we're seeing remarkable leadership from, for example, the government of Chile, that has been actively kept. Marriage equality just went into effect in Chile, but Chile is stepping forward in terms of supporting LGBTI rights, throughout the world and throughout Global South. So that is certainly a place to watch. Argentina and Uruguay were two of the first countries to promote comprehensive laws promoting transgender and intersex rights, along with Malta, which will rarely get perhaps the recognition that its government has earned, but it's a smaller population. But certainly the example of Argentina and Uruguay really does point. One, it sort of gets rid of, at least debunks some of the easy myths about Latin America being inherently conservative. And we certainly were seeing all sorts of progress in Brazil before Bolsonaro. That I think Brazil's polarization particularly mirrors what we're familiar with in the United States and elsewhere in the global north, in terms of very, very inclusive and very reactionary forces in play at the same time.
Alex, you're up. Yeah, so this kind of gets to, I think, what you were talking about earlier, but then also touched on this, the issue of these report cards and rankings, and kind of where you angle your efforts as a council. And I was just wondering, how much work do you do with the people on the ground? And you mentioned asylum seekers, but also when you are, ranking countries and you rank countries low, I feel like that could add a level of stigmatization to the citizens of that country. So, at what level do you converse and also take into account the population of the country, not necessarily the government's view on these issues, and how that plays into your role as an organization trying to, push governments to do better?
Right. So keep in mind that much of the work of the council is coordinating, our 32 members and sort of, speaking not necessarily with one voice, but at least with a voice that is strategic and, sort of the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. Um, but in a project that's specifically that of the council, like the report cards, we're currently doing civil society follow-up, talking with activists on the ground to see how can how can you use these report cards? What are the pressure points that are appropriate for your local situation? And we've had, we're still working on ways to sort of increase the feedback, but we've had some so far, and we're going to be launching a more proactive stage of getting feedback over the summer, ahead of the next round of report cards. So and that's I didn't have the chance, unfortunately, to attend our workshop on this at the recent ILGA conference, the global LGBTI organization, which came to the United States to Long Beach for the first time in many years. But we did partner with a Zambian activist to talk about the situation and figure out the strategies that would be relevant there. And I've been chatting with a colleague in Slovenia about how, which clearly is a very different context than Southern Africa.
I was thinking back to earlier in our conversation when we were talking about the speed of change and how it's a challenge for some people to keep up. And it made me think of the notion of complacency. One of the reasons that we've seen regress in some areas of racial equality in the United States is because some people feel the job was already done. Right. And so I wonder, is there a risk here when you think of things like marriage equality, great celebrations throughout the land when marriage equality became the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
But does that create complacency as well? Do some people, check the box, been there, done that, let's move on?
I do think that can be the case, especially, especially, and I think marriage is a prime example of this, where clearly, the victory at the Supreme Court around marriage equality was a tremendous victory. I'm not in any way, shape, or form interested in diminishing that. But I also recognize that not everybody is in a two-person relationship that, is, that is, promoted by, having equality, that particular form of equality. Certainly, the Bostock ruling the other year was another step forward around employment discrimination. But it's, we're seeing how much of legal equality is not always the same thing as cultural equality and cultural inclusion. And certainly, we can look around the world and find examples where one leads the other. South Africa is a prime example of where legal equality went far, far ahead of cultural equality. In many ways, American culture was, at least for lesbian, gay, and bi people, moving faster than legal change. I'm specific. I think issues around gender identity don't fit neatly into that timeline, but that we do. I think that complacency is a real danger, and it's sometimes very scary to think about the forces that are against us and how strong and organized they are.
On that thread of complacency, and John, I think that's a great point to bring up. And I can't help but think of the executive order that was just signed yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
To show kind of a not complacency, I would say. I say this is a good step forward. So I was wondering if you, for our audience, could talk about your perspective on the newest executive order, if you have any quick takes on it, especially considering conversion therapy and the funding of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for listeners, yesterday the White House announced its a major executive order, particularly aimed at protecting LGBTQ youth and families, particularly given the onslaught of anti-LGBTI legislation, throughout the United States. And there have been quite literally hundreds of bills, proposed and often passed around whether it's the broad range of LGBTI issues, specifically around trans rights, about the Don't Say Gay bills in Florida and elsewhere, the legislation promoting a specter of trans people in particular and queer people in general preying on the innocent. And this executive order was very much a response to that, with proposals tackling issues ranging from homelessness, and we know that LGBTQI youth are a huge component of youth on the streets of America. The numbers are stunning and shocking and horrifying. Conversion therapy is another major component of yesterday's executive order, primarily domestically, but with a particular directive to state treasury and a third department, HHS, I think, to come up with a set of policies around combating so-called conversion therapies, these quack cures that claim to cure people of their sexual orientation, their homosexuality, their bisexuality, their transgender identity, et cetera. And these are, the United Nations has declared conversion therapy, conversion practices to be a form of torture. The damage being, and this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, to be very clear. So the U.S., the executive order set out to, among other things, make sure that to make sure that the U.S. does not fund, that taxpayer money does not fund conversion practice work overseas. And this is sometimes just at a bureaucratic level challenge to make sure it's happened, but there's now the executive order from the White House saying this will not happen. So we're now moving in the right direction there.
It's not surprising that a discussion among the Wilson Center and the Council for Global Equality would focus on policy, right, and government actions. But I want to shift gears a bit, and in the broader context of the global struggle, and talk about soft power, right? Talk about the arts, and your thoughts on, you've seen this in the United States. It's part of the formula of how things change. Sometimes one that we underestimate, whether it's a program like Cosby and racial equality, or whether it's Modern Family and LGBTQI awareness and rights. How much is this a factor in your thinking? And are there measures, or at least anecdotally, when you look around the world, do you see this gaining traction in a way that's meaningful?
I mean, it's certainly, soft power is harder to measure. There's no question, but I do think it's absolutely essential to what we're talking about, and the power of everything, of Modern Family, or to RuPaul's Drag Race being a global phenomenon, or let's take sports and the role of out LGBTQ athletes in the United States and elsewhere. When Megan Rapinoe, and Sue Bird, win championships, and in particular in the case of the U.S. women's soccer team, fighting for linking pay equity and support for Black Lives Matter and for LGBTQI rights. This has resonance not only within the United States but around the world.
I'm sorry. Go, please.
This, and just to say, and we should really expect to see a whole lot more of this in the next few months leading up to the Qatar World Cup.
Ian, what I was going to ask you about next are Trendlines, right? What will you be watching? We've talked about some headlines, the recent executive order. What are some of the trendlines for people who care about this issue that they should be keeping their eyes on?
I think a few things come to mind. One is to sort of actively look at the parallels between what's happening inside the United States and around the world. And Florida's Don't Say Gay bill is pretty much modeled on Hungary's, legislation under Orban, which in turn draws on, Putin's 2013 anti-propaganda bill. So to look out for these, proposed laws that are again popping up in other states and other countries that are restricting freedom of speech, often in the name of protecting kids and the rights of parents, and looking out. So that gets to a second line, to look out for these, when, how can you be against parents' rights, but when are these just cloaks for sort of taking away rights? And we've seen, again, we saw with the civil rights movement, the freedom of association was used as a way to sort of reframe the battle against desegregation as a matter of protecting rights. In terms of opportunities and trend lines, I think keeping an eye on the movement towards legal gender recognition legislation for trans people is somewhere we have some, real accomplishable goals in the near future. Keeping an eye again on the work against conversion practices. And we're going to see some more marriage equality victories in the near future. Switzerland comes into effect next month. Keeping an eye on Thailand, keeping an eye on Vietnam, which would probably be the first non-democratic country to introduce marriage equality, and that certainly is a complicated situation. But obviously, it's not coming from the grassroots. But the fact that the Vietnamese government is taking steps in this direction is, at least that's positive.
Thanks. Alex, before we close, tell our viewers about other activities that you and the ERG are planning around Pride Month here at the Wilson Center.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to have a couple of different artifacts coming out. Johnny already mentioned one, which is the America's 360 podcast. And I'm just happy to see that different programs at the Wilson Center take these issues and build them into their existing and robust programming. And I'd say the one thing that I want to highlight at the end of this discussion is our event on June 29th, which is titled U.S. Diplomacy for LGBTQIA+ Rights Around the World, a snapshot and a look forward, with Special Envoy Jessica Stern from the State Department and Jay Gilliam from USAID. He's the Senior LGBTQI+ Coordinator. It is going to be a great discussion about the first annual interagency report that they put out about how we in the US use development and diplomacy to forward LGBTQIA+ human rights around the world. So should be a great discussion, and look out for it on all the usual platforms.
Terrific. Thank you. And Alex, thanks for your leadership here at the center. And Ian, that was a terrific overview. Thank you. That was fascinating.
Wonderful.
Chock full of terrific information. Anything you want to plug? I feel like I feel like a talk show host now. We just heard Alex's plug. Do you have a movie coming out, a book, anything you want
to? Good. I mean, I'm slowly getting back, in my previous life, I was a history professor, and I'm still sort of, so you could probably tell that's from some of the connections to the civil rights movement. But I am slowly winding down a book on how American gay liberation and lesbian feminism grew out of other protest movements in the 60s, queer and present dangers.
Terrific. I thought I was, just being glib, and there's an actual book in the works. Great. Glad. Thanks for sharing a little preview.
Thank you.
Ian,
Absolutely.
A pleasure to meet you. Thanks for joining us today.
Delight. Thank you for having me.
Alex, thank you as always. And to our viewers, hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again for another soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.